Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus podcast episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest is a doctoral student in psychology, podcast host, and the author of the novel The Sleeper, the Scholar, and the Stryx. His name is Joel Bouchard, and my interview with Joel will follow the teleportation sound. Joel Bouchard, welcome to the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Sure. So I am a production manager for a manufacturing facility. I'm a PhD student in psychology. I'm a musician, so I play a bunch of different instruments and record some albums and put them online. I'm the host of the philosophy podcast From Nowhere to Nothing. I'm a local government official, and I've got a bunch of other little hobbies on the side, one of which is writing. So I just published my first book, as a lot of people can probably relate to. You know, I've been writing all my life, but it's much easier to start writing things than it is to finish them. So I finally got my first book out this past summer.
As I understand it, you're a U.S. Army veteran and you have local government experience. Feel free to tell our listeners a little bit more about both of those things.
Yeah, not too much to say there. As far as military stuff goes, I was in the Army for 8 years, just Army Reserves. We had a new unit, so I never got deployed anywhere, but just did a lot of training missions and a lot of things on that side. And then, as far as the local government stuff goes, I actually got that position through my podcast, really. There was a position that became open because a board of trustees member stepped down. And the mayor of the village happened to listen to my podcast and said, "Hey, you seem like a guy who thinks pretty deeply about stuff. Normally, this is a position you have to be elected to, but in the interim, I'm allowed to appoint somebody, and I'd kind of like to appoint you. And if there's one thing I've learned in life, it's that you take opportunities when they're given to you because you never know when they might come back around." So I said, "Yeah, sure, I'll do it." So yeah, I'm currently serving a term, and that's kind of the background there.
Your novel, which was released earlier this year, is called The Sleeper, the Scholar, and the Stryx. Without spoiling too much of your novel, what is it about and what genre is your novel in?
Yeah, so this originally started as a bit of an intellectual exercise. Like I mentioned, my podcast is about philosophy. And one of the things I was reading a lot about at the time was Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces and kind of the hero's journey and, stories that, and aspects of stories that are present across the world in different cultures and things. And it kind of got me thinking about art, with the music I make or with the paintings that I do, what makes good art. And what I kind of came to the conclusion is that good art is giving people what they expect in a way they don't expect it, right? So, if you have something that's too far in left field, people can't really relate to it. But if you give something that is, too cookie cutter, it's boring. People are not interested in it. And so I was looking at this hero's journey and the hero with a thousand faces and thinking about how, success in art is trying to find that balance between giving people something familiar, but in a new way. And I thought, how can I sort of tweak some of these stages of the hero's journey and some of these archetypes that are present in such a way that, the story is still cohesive and it still has a poignant sort of narrative, but it's something that maybe people haven't seen in a certain way before. So that's where I started from. And then I thought, well, why don't I just try to do it? And I sort of fleshed out the outline last year. And then so this year between semesters, I actually sat down and wrote the book and got it released. So it's a fantasy novel. And there's a lot of some of the typical tropic aspects to it in terms of, okay, it's a medieval setting and you've got, some dragons and, some things like that. And then there's some things that aren't as typical. There's more of a pantheon of gods that sort of relate to kind of that mythological setting that I was referring to before. So it's kind of a mashup, a little bit of a mashup between some pop culture fantasy and then some deep cuts from mythology that add a new element to it, and then a narrative that people might see as familiar at first, with elements introduced that kind of throw you for a loop a little bit.
Norm Gayford was the editor of your novel. Tell our listeners a little bit about Norm and what was it like to work with Norm on your novel?
Yeah, Norm is the coolest guy on earth. He is the resident expert on my podcast. So, and where our relationship started was he was my English and philosophy professor when I first started school. Oh man, going on 20 years ago. So, when I first started attending college, yeah, I didn't know what philosophy was. And I took a class just because I needed to fill some credits. And, he really made it a very cool class. He was a very engaging character. And so, I took all of his classes and then I asked him if he wanted to do a podcast. And we've been doing that for the past 6 years. And so, as he's a philosophy professor second, but he's really an English professor. He went to Brown University for English. So I said, hey, I'm writing a book. Would you mind doing the editing for me? And of course he said, sure. So he went through and it was a fun back and forth. I think he has a lot of respect for the creative process. He's a very creative guy himself. So he didn't try to step on toes too much about changing things. There was a lot of technical English assistance, but he definitely did have some ideas and pointed out some things where he goes, maybe you want to head this direction or do something a little bit different. So it was just great. I've always enjoyed working with Norm in other ways, and as an editor for the book, he was really great as well.
What motivated you to write The Sleeper, The Scholar, and The Stryx?
Yeah, I think that it's like I mentioned, it started out as sort of an intellectual exercise for the concept of the book, but then for the story itself, trying to the message behind it, right, is something that's a little bit more personal or idiosyncratic, where I kind of reflected on some of the characters in various media that have influenced me throughout my life, and what it is that they sort of represented. And I tried to bring that to all the characters, not just the heroes, but also the villains and the anti-heroes and the supporting characters. Just tried to take elements from characters that I had experienced throughout my life, and people that I know personally that I kind of see as filling those roles, and not just incorporating them into a single story, but also trying to think about each character as their own hero. They're being a hero in their own story, and it kind of presents in a narrative that as I like to just a lot of people have said this to me, and I agree with it. It becomes a story with no main character, really, because each character has their own arc that seems equally important to what ends up taking place. So, yeah, the motivation was really to try to tell a story in a new way that incorporated elements of my experience, elements of sort of artistic expression that presented a story that comes across as being relatable, yet in a new kind of alien way because of the universe that it takes place in.
How long did it take you to write your novel, and what are the easiest and hardest aspects of writing a novel for you?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked this question, because this is important for me, for anybody out there who wants to write a novel, right? Like I mentioned earlier in the episode, I've tried to write things for years, and have never been able to successfully finish something, because anybody who's an author kind of knows, it's easy to write yourself into a corner, or to run out of ideas, or, to forget where a character's going, any of those types of things. So when I sat down to write this book, I wanted to make sure that none of those things happened. And I researched different writing methods. And the one that I ended up settling on was the snowflake method, because it seemed like something that I could work with on and off, that was pretty foolproof. If I followed through on it, I could finish the book, and provided a lot of ability to be artistically flexible as well. So basically, the snowflake method, you write uh, your whole story in just one sentence. One sentence. What's the story about? And then you take that sentence and you flesh it out into a paragraph. Then you take each sentence in that paragraph and make it its own paragraph. And then you write your character bios and your things. And then you revisit the paragraphs that you've written, and you write a scene for each sentence. And then you flesh out the scenes, and it's sort of like connect the dots, right? Eventually you kind of connect the dots to write the story. So overall, I think that it took me about 4 weeks of full-time work, so probably about 160 hours from beginning to end. And that's from story conception, just starting to think about how to write it to actually publishing it. So that's pretty short. It's not a whole lot of time because if I'm being honest, I'm not somebody with a whole lot of time. I'm a very busy guy. And so I tend to work very fast with other things in my life as well. So yeah, I can't speak highly enough for the snowflake method. It allowed me to just sit down for little snippets of time and write, work away at it, kind of chip away at it. And then it made the actual writing process very enjoyable, and allowed me to kind of express the story and even change it in little ways that made it more complete and more fulfilling at the end.
Is the Sleeper, the Scholar, and the Stryx self-published, traditionally published, or hybrid published?
Yeah, it's just self-published. That's the way that I always joke with people that I'm the world's worst marketer. I like to do things. I like to have experiences. I like to learn and explore stuff, but I'm not really interested in making money or even reaching a wider audience per se. The joy to me is writing the book, and then being able to go on and explore it a little bit deeper down the road. But yeah, no, it's just self-published.
As you mentioned a couple of times early on in the interview, you host a podcast called From Nowhere to Nothing. Now, there is more than nowhere or nothing in your podcast. So what can listeners expect from a typical episode of your podcast?
Yeah, so the podcast, it's a philosophy podcast. And what I was trying to do with the concept of the podcast was recreate some of the conversations that I had in my first philosophy class with Norm Gayford. So what we do usually is we'll just take one or two words and we'll explore them over the course of an hour. And we'll usually start with formative aspects of it. So what have philosophers said about a topic throughout history? Then we'll go on to defining the essence of a topic, really talk about what the cutting edge science or thought is regarding something. And then at the end, we'll look at sort of speculative aspects of it. Given the things that philosophers have said historically, given our modern knowledge about something, what are the implications for humanity or for individual people or for the universe, right? So, yeah, it's fun. We usually take a deep dive into just one or two words.
In addition to being a doctoral student in psychology, a novelist, and a podcast host, you're also a multi-instrumentalist music producer. What genres or forms of music do you produce, and are you a musician yourself?
Yeah. So I basically the way that I work is I'll write some songs, and then I've got a recording studio here where I record my podcast and my music. And I just record all the parts separately, right? So I play bass, drums, guitar, keyboard. I sing, play a little bit of ukulele and mandolin and dulcimer and some other things. And just kind of assemble it here, mix it, master it, and release it. And my music tends to be, I refer to it as being kind of psychedelic rock, but it has, I'm heavily influenced by progressive musicians as well. So some progressive elements to some of it. I've done some songs that are, 20 minutes long, as well as some shorter commercial pieces. And additionally, I'll produce some other people's albums. So I've done folk albums and electronic albums and a few other different types for other people. But yeah, my own music tends to be kind of an alternative rock style. And yeah, I've got 5 albums online along with some EPs and singles and different things. So if people are interested in listening to those, you can just search my name wherever you listen to music, and you should be able to find it.
You are, my last two questions are going to be about you being, are going to be, I should say, tangentially related to you being a doctoral student in psychology. My first of these questions is, what is philosophy, and is philosophy relevant in modern times?
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Um, I think that philosophy has the world's worst publicist, right? Because kind of like I mentioned, when I went to college and I went to take the class, I didn't really know what philosophy was. And I think a lot of people don't really know what philosophy was. And a lot of people sort of have this conception that it was something that, it all took place with Plato and Aristotle, back in ancient Greece, or yeah, maybe during the Enlightenment there was Descartes or Rousseau or a couple other people, but for the most part, philosophy's done. It's kind of a dead course of inquiry, so there's not really much point in thinking about it. And nothing could be further from the truth. Philosophy is highly relevant to every person, right? And part of what I like telling people is that philosophy is your favorite topic. You just don't know it yet, right? Because what philosophy is the thought process behind why we believe what we believe and why we do what we do. And so, some people think about it a little bit more deeply than other people, but all of us have things that we take very seriously and that we've thought very deeply about. And anything that you have thought about very deeply, you've thought about philosophically, and anybody who has thought very deeply about something to some extent is a philosopher. So yeah, very relevant to anybody, regardless of who you are. And we try to demonstrate that in the show, because we've looked at big topics like God and time, but we've also done Disney princesses, right? We've done entertainment franchise reboots. We've done kind of small, lighthearted topics that some people might think are inconsequential. But when you really start looking at them and you really start digging down and thinking deeply about them, they are relevant. They are important. So yeah, that's kind of my pitch for philosophy.
In your opinion, is higher education useful, and why or why not?
Yeah, I think that it depends on what you're trying to get out of it. And I don't think that answer is going to be the same for everybody. So I think that the common narrative that kind of pervades society is that the purpose of higher education is job training. And if you take that route, then the answer depends on what degree you go for, right? If you get a STEM degree and you manage to get it from a prestigious college and you manage to secure a good job, then yeah, then it's worth it to you. If you you want to pursue fashion design at a very expensive college, but you don't really have any idea of how you're going to leverage that into a career, then it probably wasn't worth it to you from a material employment standpoint. I know for me personally, higher education is something that I see as a personally fulfilling endeavor. So, I don't plan on using my education to get a new job or to make more money, right? As a matter of fact, my educational journey is pretty diverse. I have an associate's degree in criminal justice. I've got a bachelor's degree in interdisciplinary studies. I have a master's degree in education. Now I'm getting a PhD in psychology, right? So it's sort of all over the map. And the reason that it's all over the map is because I've always wanted to study things that I'm interested in. I'm been very fortunate that, being a veteran of the Army, I'm able to attain a lot of higher education for a reduced price, right? If I wasn't a veteran, I probably either wouldn't be able to do what I'm doing educationally, or I would have to adjust my route in order to make sure that what I was studying did provide me with a job that made a significant amount of money in order to pay for that education. I'm lucky not to be in that position, but I think that the point is that your motivations for education, your resources, your plan for how you use that education, all of those things sort of play into that answer of whether or not it's worth it, you know? And I think it's a very kind of individual choice, you know, and there's a lot of, with the price of education increasing, and job markets being more difficult to break into, people who view it as a job training kind of resource have become a little bit dissatisfied with it and kind of questioned the relevance of it. But higher education is a lot more than that, right? I mean, if higher education is where all of our research and technology happens, right? So if you don't have people training scientists, training educators, training, you know, technological developers, training, you know, even English professors and philosophy professors, right? Then the society as a whole suffers, right? And progress as a whole suffers. So I think that, you know, undoubtedly it's worth it to humanity as a whole. And on an individual level, it's a much more personal question that has to take a lot of other variables into account.
Joel, thank you for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus podcast. You were an amazing guest.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun.
It was amazing to interview Joel, and I'll include links to both Joel's novel and his podcast in the text description of the episode. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to find your writing and reading purpose. Bye for now. Copyright 2024, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.